Ever get the feeling like, like there's this hidden script kind of dictating how we think about the world?
Yeah, like a playbook.
A playbook, yeah. And today we're kind of cracking open that playbook, you know, diving deep into this thing called cultural hegemony.
Oh, yeah, this is a good one.
It's a fascinating topic. And, we've got some great sources that help us unpack this whole idea of power dynamics, but like the subtle kind of the stuff that goes on beneath the surface.
Yeah, it's not always about, armies and laws.
Exactly. And our mission today, well, it's to figure out how this whole cultural hegemony thing actually plays out in our everyday lives.
Right, because it's everywhere once you start to see it.
So let's start with the basics.
Okay.
What is cultural hegemony really all about?
Well, it's a concept that comes from this thinker named Antonio Gramsci, and basically it's how the dominant group in any society, the ones in power, they kind of subtly shape what everyone thinks and believes and what's considered normal.
So it's not like they're forcing these ideas on us, right?
It's much more clever than that.
It's more like it becomes common sense.
Exactly. They make it seem like their way is the only natural way.
Okay, so it's like rule by consent almost.
Exactly. Yeah, you consent without even realizing you're consenting.
So how does that actually work in practice?
Well, let's look at an example that our source brings up the idea that hard work always leads to success.
Okay, but I mean, there's some truth to that, right? Like you've got to put in the effort.
Sure, effort is important. But the thing is, if we just accept blindly that hard work always equals success, well, then we're missing the bigger picture.
Like what?
Like all the systemic barriers that exist for lots of people. Things like your economic background,
Yeah.
your race, where you grew up, even just plain luck.
Yeah, you don't always start on a level playing field.
Exactly. And that's what cultural hegemony does. It makes us think, oh, if you're not succeeding, you're just not working hard enough. And it stops us from seeing those systemic issues.
So it's like a way of maintaining the status quo, even if that status quo isn't fair to everyone.
Right? It becomes the common sense view, even if it's not really that common or sensible when you look closely.
And our source talks about certain institutions that are really important for spreading these dominant ideas, right?
Absolutely. Things like education, the media, entertainment.
Yeah, all the stuff we're exposed to every day.
Exactly. These are like the channels through which these ideas get transmitted.
So like in school, you might learn a certain version of history.
Right, the version that supports the dominant group's narrative.
And then the media frames things in a particular way.
Yeah, they decide what stories get told, what gets emphasized, what gets ignored.
And entertainment, movies, TV shows, all that stuff.
They can normalize certain lifestyles, values, beliefs, and make alternatives seem undesirable.
So it's not like there's some evil mastermind controlling everything, right?
Not necessarily. It's more like a system that reinforces itself over time.
But why should we care about this?
Yeah.
Like, what's the actual impact of cultural hegemony?
Well, if you think about it, this can lead to people not even questioning things that are actually harmful to them.
Can you give an example?
Like you might see people who are struggling financially, but they still support policies that benefit the wealthy.
Because they think it's fair or that they'll benefit someday too.
Exactly. Or they might dismiss alternative ways of organizing society, like more socialist systems.
Because they've been taught to see those as dangerous or unrealistic.
Right. And I think the key takeaway here is that cultural hegemony isn't just about what we believe, it's also about what we don't think to question.
It's like those blind spots we all have.
Yeah, and those blind spots can really hurt us.
Okay, so the source also talks about this concept of counter-hegemony.
Yeah.
So what's that all about? Like, how do we actually challenge these dominant narratives?
Counter-hegemony is about disrupting that common sense worldview that we've been talking about.
Okay, how do we do that?
Well, the source mentions a few things. Critical education that encourages people to question assumptions.
Okay.
Independent media that offers different perspectives and the power of art and grassroots movements to create new narratives and ways of thinking.
I like that art is a form of resistance.
Yeah, it can be really powerful. And the source also mentions these organic intellectuals.
Organic intellectuals.
Yeah, it sounds kind of funny, but basically they're like natural leaders and thinkers who emerge from within specific communities.
Okay.
So they deeply understand the lived experiences of those communities, and they can articulate their struggles, their hopes, their visions for change.
So it's not just academics in their ivory towers.
Right. It's people on the ground who are directly affected by these issues.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So all of these things can contribute to building counter-hegemony, to pushing back against those dominant narratives.
So this is all really interesting in theory, but can we make it a bit more concrete?
Sure.
The source mentions some real-life examples,
Yeah.
like the American dream.
Oh, that's a classic one.
Right. So how does the American dream fit into all of this?
Well, the idea that anyone can succeed through hard work and determination, it's a really powerful narrative in American culture.
Yeah, we're all taught that from a young age.
Yeah. Right. But the problem is that it often ignores those systemic disadvantages we talked about earlier,
Yeah.
race, class, access to education, all that stuff.
So it can be a way of masking the real inequalities in our society.
Exactly. It creates this illusion of a level playing field when in reality it's not.
And the source also mentions the example of colonial India.
Yeah.
So how did cultural hegemony play out there?
Well, the British used education and media to legitimize their rule.
So they were shaping the narrative.
Exactly. They were teaching Indian people that British rule was beneficial, that it was bringing progress and civilization.
And that helped to maintain their power.
Right, because it created a certain level of consent even within the colonized population.
Wow. So it's not just about economics or military force, it's also about controlling the narrative.
Absolutely. And another example that the source mentions is something we see all the time these days, corporate greenwashing.
Greenwashing.
Yeah, like when companies promote these small environmental initiatives.
Make themselves look good?
Exactly, but they're often doing much more harm in other areas.
So it's like a PR tactic to shape public perception.
Exactly. They're controlling the narrative again.
Okay, so all of this is really eye-opening. But how does understanding cultural hegemony actually help us today? Like, why is this relevant now?
Well, I think it helps us make sense of why certain ideas about our economy or society are so deeply ingrained, even if they don't benefit everyone.
Like why people might defend capitalism even though it has all these problems.
Exactly. Or why the idea of collective action or, working together for change can seem so radical to some people.
Because we've been conditioned to think individualistically.
Right. And the source makes this really important point that systemic injustice can actually become invisible to the people who benefit from it.
Because it's just seen as normal.
Exactly. The dominant culture has normalized it.
So it's like we need to develop this new lens to see the world differently.
Absolutely, we need to start questioning those common sense assumptions.
Okay, so to kind of bring it all together, the core idea here is that cultural hegemony is about the power of ideas, and that culture itself is this constant battleground of competing narratives.
Right. It's an ongoing struggle for who gets to define reality.
And that brings up a really important question for all of us listening. If these dominant narratives are so powerful at shaping how we understand the world, what are some of the subtle narratives in our own lives, in our own communities, that might be worth examining more closely?
What things have we just accepted as true without really questioning them?
And what would it mean to challenge those narratives?
Because that's where real change begins.
By questioning the stories we tell ourselves and the stories we're told.
Exactly.
Something to think about.
Yeah, for sure.
Until next time.
See you then.